Last summer, we got to visit France, and we were in vineyard country. We were east of Bordeaux, and we were staying in a friend's house, but it was surrounded by all these vineyards. It had massive castles and chateaus. They obviously were really wealthy, that was for sure. Well, in this story, in this parable that Jesus told, he's telling us about a vineyard and an owner. It says in verse 1, he then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for a winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. And then while away on his journey, as the parable unfolds, it says he sends servants to collect the fruit. And as he sends them, the first one gets beaten up by the tenants. The second one gets beaten up as well. And the third one he sends actually even gets killed. So he's got one last resort, which is what we read in verse 6. He had one left to send, a son, whom he loved. He sent them last of all, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. So the owner sent his one and only son whom he loved, and they killed him. Verse 9 says, well, what then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. So what's going on with this parable, this story with a meaning? Well, verse 12 is like a punchline, and it helps shed light on it because it's talking about the chief priests, the religious leaders of the day. And it says, then they looked for a way to arrest him, Jesus, because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. So the religious leaders knew it was speaking about them. They were the tenants. So what was going on in this parable? Well, you see, the owner of the vineyard is a picture of God. And the vineyard itself is actually a picture of Israel. And how God had done everything for Israel, had planted it, given them everything. He put a hedge around them. And yet the tenants, the farmers, they represent the religious leaders, the chief priests who ignored and rejected the messengers of God, the prophets probably. So then he sends his one and only son. The son of the owner, of course, is Jesus, God's one and only son. And see, the religious leaders know they're talking about them, the parables against them, because they were plotting to kill Jesus right at that very moment in time. So they're probably looking at one another and going, how does he know this? And they did have him killed. 3 days later, Jesus was nailed to the cross. But amazing thing is, this was all part of God's plan. He had predicted it, that Jesus would be rejected and killed. And that's what he says to those religious leaders in verse 10. Haven't you read this scripture, quoting from the Old Testament hundreds of years earlier? Jesus, who's referred to as the stone, Jesus, the builders rejected, has become the cornerstone, the capstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The fact that Jesus is rejected and killed and predicted hundreds of years earlier is called a marvelous thing, because this was all God's plan to rescue a people. So what do we learn from this parable? Well, we have to ask ourselves the question, are we in any way like the tenants, the farm owners? Do we reject God, who has given us so much, who has given us our health, our wealth, given us everything to enjoy? And do we forget the giver and live for the gifts? And just live for what we can get? That's what they were doing, these tenant farmers. Or maybe we reject Jesus in other ways. Maybe a messenger sent, maybe somebody has told you, you got to consider Jesus. Look at who Jesus is, what he has done. That'll offer you hope in this life and for the life to come. And you've just dismissed it out of hand. It's a load of nonsense. And you're rejecting Jesus in that way. Or maybe we were rejecting Jesus in the same way the religious leaders did, by thinking they could get acceptance from God, a place in heaven, by being good, by keeping all the rules. And we've got to realize that we've all failed, that we can never live up to that standard. But that is why God sent Jesus. And it was predicted and planned centuries past that God would send Jesus, who would be rejected, who would be despised, who would be killed, who would be crucified and nailed to a cross for our sin, so that we, through trusting in him, could be completely forgiven. So won't you marvel at this wonderful plan? Meditate on God's amazing love in sending Jesus, who came and who was willingly despised and rejected, so that you and I could be accepted through faith in him.